Aaron Harper returns to a life he left behind years ago, hoping to reconnect with Madeline, the daughter he barely knows. But Madeline, who grew up without him, is fiercely independent and guarded, having managed the family farm alone since her mother's passing. Now, Aaron must prove he deserves a place in her life, even as old wounds and deep-seated resentment surface. With the help of Luke, a protective family friend, Madeline faces a choice: to forgive or to keep Aaron at a distance forever. Can a broken family truly find healing after so many years apart? Join us on this journey of trust, forgiveness, and hope. If you're ready, please like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Do you believe in second chances? Let's dive into the story. Aaron Harper tightened his grip on the steering wheel, feeling the vibration of his rental car's tires as they rumbled over the rough country road. He hadn't traveled these back roads in years, and as he glanced around at the empty fields stretching to the horizon, he realized just how alien they felt to him now. He'd lived in cities for too long, surrounded by tall buildings, busy streets, and the comfort of anonymity. But here, in the middle of the countryside, there was only silence, and the memories he'd tried so hard to bury. The headlights cut through the thick darkness that seemed to swallow the world around him. His GPS had gone out miles back, leaving him with only his phone, which now showed 0 bars, and a vague sense that he was lost. He sighed, glancing out into the inky blackness. It seemed to press in on him, suffocating, a reminder of all the empty places he'd left in his own life. He hadn't intended to end up here. This trip back to the States was supposed to be a simple business meeting, a brief detour before heading back to the life he'd built overseas. But somewhere along the way, the pull of his past had taken over, and he'd found himself steering the car down familiar but distant roads, feeling the ghosts of old choices brushing against his conscience. He wondered if this journey had been inevitable all along. A shudder ran through the car, and Aaron frowned, easing off the gas as the vehicle began to slow. He tapped the brakes, but the car's response was sluggish. His heart sank as he realized the engine was failing, the faint flicker of the dashboard lights signaling the end of his journey, at least for tonight. No, not now, he muttered, guiding the car to the side of the road as it coasted to a stop. He tried the ignition a few more times, but it was useless. The car was dead, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere. He let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. As he stepped out of the car, the biting cold seeped through his jacket, making him shiver. He scanned the empty road, searching for any sign of life, but there was only the faint outline of fields and distant tree lines silhouetted against the night sky. Then, in the distance, he noticed a faint glimmer of light, barely visible through the mist that hung low over the land. It was the only sign of life in miles, and with no other options, he started walking. The air was sharp and biting, each breath leaving a thin plume of mist in its wake. The ground was soft beneath his feet, damp from the recent rains, and he could feel his shoes sinking into the mud with each step. The walk seemed endless, the cold seeping into his bones as he pushed forward, each step taking him closer to the light that now felt like a beacon in the darkness. As he walked, memories he'd long tried to suppress began to surface. He thought of Caroline, the woman he'd left behind so many years ago, the life they might have had together if he'd stayed. He'd been young and ambitious, full of dreams of success that had taken him far from the quiet simplicity of the countryside. But those dreams had come at a cost, one he was only beginning to understand now, as he faced the empty road ahead. When he finally reached the farmhouse, he paused, taking in the sight of it. It was an old structure, worn by years of weather and hard work, yet it held a certain charm. The windows glowed with a warm, inviting light that seemed almost out of place in the desolate landscape. Aaron hesitated at the door, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and unease. He hadn't planned on ending up here, on this doorstep, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow meant to be here, that this moment was a crossroads he hadn't expected but couldn't avoid. He knocked softly, then waited, his breath forming a thin mist in the chilly air. When no one answered, he knocked again, a bit louder this time. He heard footsteps approaching from inside, and then the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her early 30s, her gaze sharp and wary. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped but polite. She looked him over, her eyes assessing him with the guardedness of someone who wasn't accustomed to strangers knocking at her door in the dead of night. Aaron cleared his throat, offering her a small, hesitant smile. "I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down a mile or so back, and I don't have a signal out here. I was hoping I could stay until morning, maybe call for a tow once I have reception." She looked him over, her gaze lingering on the fine lines of his coat, his polished shoes, the marks of a man who didn't belong in a place like this. "Are you alone?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Yes, just me," he assured her. "I don't mean to intrude. I just need a place to stay for the night." She considered him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to decide whether he was trustworthy. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "I have a room out in the barn. It's simple, but it'll keep you out of the cold." Relief washed over him, and he allowed himself a genuine smile. "Thank you. I really appreciate it." Without another word, she stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. He followed her into the warmth of the house, taking in the quiet simplicity of the space. It was cozy, filled with the faint scent of wood smoke and something floral, perhaps lavender or rosemary, a scent that reminded him faintly of Caroline. The furniture was old but well cared for, each piece carefully placed as though it had been chosen with purpose. He noticed a small shelf filled with books, their spines worn, the titles faded, and a few small trinkets scattered across the mantel. But what caught his attention most was a marble sculpture on a table in the corner of the room, illuminated by a soft, warm light. Aaron's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the sculpture. It was a piece by Caroline, a work he would have known anywhere. She'd always had a gift for capturing beauty and simplicity, for bringing life to cold stone in a way that left him breathless. He felt a rush of memories, images of her studio in Europe, the way she'd laugh as she worked, her hands moving gracefully over the clay. The woman noticed his gaze lingering on the sculpture and followed his line of sight. "That piece, it's beautiful," he said softly, struggling to keep the emotion from his voice. "Did your mother make it?" She looked at him with a flicker of surprise before nodding. "Yes, my mother was an artist. She made a few sculptures before she moved out here." Aaron felt a shock ripple through him, a realization dawning that left him speechless. This woman was Caroline's daughter. He struggled to process the implications, his mind racing as he tried to reconcile the past with the present. You knew her?" she asked, her tone cautious but curious, as though sensing the sudden shift in his demeanor. He took a breath, his voice thick with emotion. "I did. A long time ago. I met her when I was living in Europe. She was an incredible artist." The woman's expression hardened slightly, a glint of mistrust entering her eyes. "She never mentioned you," she said, her tone edged with suspicion. Aaron swallowed, feeling the weight of his absence pressing down on him. "I didn't know she had a daughter," he said softly, the words filled with a regret he couldn't disguise. "If I had, things might have been different." She looked away, her jaw tight, a storm of emotions flickering across her face. "My mother didn't talk much about the past," she said quietly. "She always told me that the people who mattered would be there when it counted. And you weren't." The accusation in her voice was sharp, cutting through him like a knife. He wanted to explain, to tell her that he hadn't known, that he would have been there if he'd had any idea. But he could see in her eyes that she wasn't ready to hear it, that his words would only deepen the rift between them. She straightened, her expression cooling as she met his gaze. "I'll show you to the barn," she said curtly, turning toward the door. Aaron followed her silently, the warmth of the house fading as they stepped out into the cold night. He could feel the weight of her mistrust, the walls she'd built around herself, and he knew that breaking through them would be a slow and difficult process. But as he looked back at the house, at the sculpture that stood as a testament to Caroline's life, he felt a determination settle over him. He would stay however long it took. The dawn broke quietly over the farm, casting a soft golden light across the fields and barns. Aaron sat up in the small room he'd been given in the barn, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he tried to piece together the events of the previous night. His mind was a blur of memories and emotions, each one tangling with the other in a way that left him feeling raw and exposed. He hadn't seen Caroline in years, hadn't allowed himself to dwell on what might have been. But now, faced with her daughter, he found himself unable to push those memories away. They flooded him, each one a reminder of the life he'd left behind, the choices he'd made in pursuit of a dream that had ultimately left him empty. When he stepped outside, he found Madeline already at work, her movements brisk and efficient as she fed the animals and checked the fences. She seemed oblivious to his presence, her focus entirely on the task at hand. "Good morning," he called, his voice tentative. She looked up, her expression guarded as she nodded in acknowledgement. "Morning." He hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. "I wanted to thank you again for letting me stay," he said, trying to find a way to connect with her. She shrugged, her gaze drifting back to the fence she was mending. "You didn't have anywhere else to go," she replied, her tone dismissive. Aaron felt the sting of her words, but forced himself to keep his tone light. "Still, I appreciate it. I know it wasn't easy for you to let a stranger into your home." She didn't respond, her focus remaining on her work as though his presence was little more than an inconvenience. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands tightened around the tools she held. He wanted to say more, to tell her the truth of why he was here, but he could sense that she wasn't ready. For now, all he could do was be patient, to let her come to him in her own time. Aaron spent the rest of the morning working alongside Madeline in silence, both of them falling into the quiet rhythm of farm work. Though he was unaccustomed to the physical demands, he found an unexpected comfort in the simplicity of the tasks. The repetitive motion of lifting hay bales, the clean scent of the freshly turned soil, the warmth of the sun breaking through the chill of the morning air. Madeline's instructions were brief and to the point, each one delivered with a clipped tone that kept him at arm's length. She seemed to have an innate understanding of the land and its needs, her movements efficient, each task performed with practiced ease. Aaron was struck by her quiet strength, the resilience she carried like a shield, and he couldn't help but feel a growing admiration for her. "Have you been running this place on your own?" he asked, breaking the silence as he tossed a bale of hay into the feed trough. Madeline paused, glancing at him from the corner of her eye before nodding. "I've had help now and then, but mostly yes." There was a note of pride in her voice, a pride he suspected was hard-won. He wanted to ask her more, to understand how she'd managed to keep the farm going after her mother's passing. But he could sense her reluctance to share, the walls she'd built around herself growing taller with every question he asked. Instead, he tried a different approach. "This place, it's beautiful," he said softly, letting his gaze drift across the fields, the pastures stretching out beneath the wide blue sky. "It has a sense of peace to it." Madeline's expression softened for a brief moment, a flicker of emotion crossing her face before she looked away. "It's all I have left of her," she murmured, almost as if to herself. The weight of her words settled over him, a reminder of all he'd missed, all he'd left behind. He'd walked away from Caroline without realizing what he was giving up, and now, faced with the life she'd built in his absence, he felt a surge of regret so powerful it left him breathless. "I'm sorry," he said softly, the words slipping out before he could stop them, "for not being here when it mattered." Madeline stiffened, her gaze hardening as she turned to face him. "Don't," she replied, her voice sharp. "You don't get to apologize now. Not after everything." Aaron swallowed, the sting of her words cutting through him. "I understand," he said, his voice low. I wish things had been different." She didn't respond, her expression unreadable as she turned back to her work. And in that moment, Aaron realized that whatever forgiveness he sought would not come easily. He would have to earn it slowly, one day at a time. The days slipped by in a blur of work and quiet tension. Aaron found himself rising early each morning, his body adjusting to the relentless demands of the farm. Though his muscles ached and his hands grew calloused, he felt a strange satisfaction in the work, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Madeline's presence was a constant, her quiet resilience a reminder of all she'd endured in his absence. She rarely spoke to him beyond the bare minimum required to complete the tasks at hand, And though he longed to bridge the gap between them, he knew that any attempt to reach out too quickly would only push her further away. One evening, as they worked side by side repairing a section of fence near the far pasture, Aaron decided to take a risk. "Your mother, Caroline. She was always determined," he said, his tone gentle. "When she put her mind to something, there was no stopping her." Madeline didn't respond at first, her focus remaining on the fence post as she drove a nail into the wood. But he saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the faint softening of her expression. She said quietly, her voice barely audible. "She built this place from the ground up. Even when things got hard, she never gave up." Aaron nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He could imagine Caroline here, her hands calloused from the work, her spirit unbroken by the challenges of farm life. She'd always had a strength that had drawn him to her, a fire that had set her apart from anyone else he'd ever known. "I should have been here," he murmured, his voice filled with regret. "I should have been a part of this." Madeline's gaze shifted, a flash of anger sparking in her eyes. "Well, you weren't," she replied, her tone cold. "And we managed just fine without you." The bitterness in her words struck him, a reminder of all he'd missed, all the years that had slipped by while he'd been living his life far from this place. But he knew he couldn't change the past. All he could do was be here now, for as long as she would let him. "I know," he said softly, the sincerity in his voice unwavering. "But I want to help now, if you'll let me." She looked away, her jaw tight as she took a steadying breath. "I don't need your help," she replied, though her tone lacked the conviction it once held. "I've been managing just fine on my own." Aaron nodded, respecting her need for independence, even as he felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, in time, she might let him in. As the days turned into weeks, Aaron settled into the rhythms of the farm, his presence becoming less of an intrusion and more of a quiet addition to Madeline's world. Though she remained guarded, there were moments, brief and fleeting, when he saw a glimmer of vulnerability in her eyes, a hint of the pain she carried beneath her hardened exterior. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day's work, Aaron found himself studying her, trying to understand the depth of her resilience, the strength she'd drawn from a life that had demanded more of her than he could have imagined. "Madeline," he began, his voice gentle, "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I'd like to understand what it was like for you growing up here, what it was like without me." She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun dipped below the hills, casting a warm glow over the fields. For a long time, she was silent, the only sound the faint rustling of the trees and the distant call of a nightbird. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. It was hard, watching her struggle, knowing there was no one else to help. She never complained, but I could see it. In the way she'd sit at the end of the day, her shoulders slumped, her hands raw from the work. Aaron felt a pang of guilt, the weight of her words settling over him like a burden he could never truly carry. "She deserved so much more," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. "And so did you." Madeline's gaze flickered toward him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Maybe," she replied, her tone clipped, "but we didn't get it." He looked away, the silence between them stretching out, filled with all the words he couldn't say, all the apologies he knew would never be enough. But even as the weight of his absence pressed down on him, he felt a growing determination to be here, to make up for the years he'd lost, however imperfectly. "I know I can't make up for the past," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "But I want to be here now, for as long as you'll let me." She didn't respond, her gaze drifting back to the horizon. And in that moment, Aaron understood that forgiveness would be a slow journey, one he would have to walk at her pace, with her guidance. He could only hope that, in time, she might come to see him as something more than the father who had failed her. Over the next few days, Aaron noticed a subtle shift in Madeline's demeanor, a quiet acceptance of his presence that was both encouraging and fragile. Though she still kept him at a distance, there was a softness to her gaze, a faint flicker of something that gave him hope. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing the barn's roof, Aaron felt a sudden urge to ask about her life, to understand the years he'd missed, the moments he could never reclaim. But he held back, sensing that any questions might be met with resistance. Instead, he focused on the work, letting the silence between them settle into a comfortable rhythm. As he hammered a nail into place, he glanced over at her, noticing the way her face softened in the afternoon light, a quiet determination etched into her features. "Thank you," he said suddenly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. She looked at him, a faint crease of confusion appearing between her brows. "For what?" "For letting me be here," he replied, his voice filled with quiet sincerity. "I know it wasn't easy for you to let a stranger into your life. Especial, a stranger like me." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful. "I didn't do it for you," she replied, her tone firm. "I did it because I didn't have any other choice." The words stung, a reminder of the walls she'd built around herself, the defenses she kept in place to protect the life she'd fought so hard to build. But he nodded, accepting her answer, knowing that any sign of gratitude would have to come in her own time. "I understand," he said softly, "but I'm still grateful." She didn't respond, turning back to her work with a determined set to her jaw. And in that moment, Aaron knew that whatever fragile progress they'd made was still vulnerable, still tentative, but it was a start. The first chill of winter swept across the valley, coating the farm in a light frost that sparkled in the morning sunlight. Aaron pulled his coat tighter around him as he worked to mend a section of fencing near the pasture. The air was sharp, biting at his fingers as he wrestled with the cold wire, his breath forming misty clouds that lingered in the stillness. Madeline was nearby, her movements brisk and efficient as she fed the animals. She hadn't spoken to him that morning beyond a brief nod of acknowledgement, but he sensed a subtle softening in her stance, a quiet acceptance of his presence, even if it was tinged with the same guardedness she always wore. As he worked, the rumble of an engine broke the silence, drawing his attention to the dirt road that ran along the edge of the property. A truck pulled up, its tires crunching over the gravel as it came to a stop. Aaron straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans as he watched a man step out of the vehicle. The newcomer was tall, with a rugged look that spoke of years of hard work. His eyes held a sharp, assessing gaze as he looked at Aaron, his expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He was built like a man who'd spent his life on farms, his shoulders broad, his posture relaxed yet somehow imposing. Madeline looked up, a faint smile breaking through her usual stoicism as she waved to the man. "Luke," she called, her voice warmer than Aaron had ever heard it. Luke gave her a nod before his gaze returned to Aaron, his expression guarded. "So, who's this?" he asked, his tone polite but tinged with wariness. Madeline glanced at Aaron before responding, her tone casual. "This is Aaron. He's helping out around here." Aaron extended a hand, offering Luke a small, uncertain smile. "Nice to meet you," he said, hoping to ease the tension he felt building between them. Luke's grip was firm as he shook Aaron's hand, though his expression remained unreadable. "Luke Porter," he replied, his tone clipped. "I help Madeline when I can." Aaron nodded, sensing the weight behind Luke's words. It was clear that Luke wasn't just a neighbor. He was a protective presence in Madeline's life, someone who had been there when she needed support. Aaron felt a pang of discomfort, a reminder of all the years he'd missed, the moments he could never reclaim. "Well," Luke continued, his gaze shifting between the two of them, "I'd better get to work. Just thought I'd stop by and see if you needed anything." Madeline gave him a grateful smile. "Thanks, Luke. I appreciate it." With a final nod to Aaron, Luke turned and walked toward the barn, his posture relaxed but his gaze still wary. Aaron watched him go, a mixture of admiration and envy filling him. Luke had been there for Madeline, had stepped into a role that Aaron had abandoned long ago. And though he couldn't begrudge Luke's loyalty, he couldn't help but feel like an intruder, an outsider trying to find his place in a life that had moved on without him. Over the next few days, Aaron became increasingly aware of Luke's presence on the farm. The man was a constant, appearing almost daily to lend a hand with repairs, check on the animals, and ensure that everything was running smoothly. He seemed to know the place inside and out, his familiarity with the land and Madeline's routines a reminder of the bond they shared. Aaron did his best to stay out of Luke's way, focusing on his own work and trying to prove himself through actions rather than words. But he could feel Luke's skepticism, the unspoken questions hanging between them every time they crossed paths. One afternoon, as Aaron was stacking firewood near the house, he caught sight of Luke approaching, his expression serious. Aaron braced himself, sensing that whatever Luke had to say would not be easy to hear. "Got a minute?" Luke asked, his tone calm but firm. Aaron nodded, setting down the logs and wiping his hands on his jeans. "Of course." Luke stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady. "Look, I don't know what brought you back here," he began, his voice low, "but Madeline's been through a lot. She doesn't need someone showing up out of nowhere and complicating her life." Aaron felt the sting of Luke's words, the accusation beneath the surface, but he held his ground. "I understand that," he replied evenly. "I'm not here to hurt her. I want to help." Luke's eyes narrowed, his stance rigid. "Help? You weren't here when her mother passed. You weren't here when the farm was falling apart. So what exactly do you think you can help with now?" Aaron took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I know I missed a lot, more than I can ever make up for. But I'm here now, and I want to be a part of her life. I want to be there for her, in whatever way she'll let me." Luke shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "So, now you want to play hero? You think a few weeks of hard work is going to make up for years of absence?" Aaron felt a surge of frustration, the weight of Luke's distrust pressing down on him. But he knew he couldn't argue with Luke's point. He had left, and nothing he could say would change that. "I'm not trying to be a hero," he said quietly. "I just want a chance to be here, to do what I should have done a long time ago." Luke studied him for a long moment, his gaze unyielding. "Well, don't expect her to forgive you," he muttered. "Madeline doesn't need you. She's managed just fine without you, and she'll keep managing without you." With that, Luke turned and walked away, leaving Aaron standing alone, the weight of his words settling over him like a shroud. He knew that earning Madeline's trust wouldn't be easy, but Luke's warning only solidified his resolve. He couldn't walk away now, not when there was even a small chance of building something with her. That evening, as they sat down for a quiet dinner, Aaron could feel the tension lingering between him and Madeline. She seemed more distant than usual, her gaze fixed on her plate as though lost in thought. He wondered if Luke had spoken to her, if the man's protectiveness had only reinforced the walls she kept so carefully in place. After a long silence, he decided to break the quiet. "Madeline," he began, his tone gentle, "I know I've been an unexpected presence here, and I don't want to make things harder for you." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Then why are you here?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "Why now, after all this time?" The question hung between them, each word carrying the weight of years of absence. Aaron took a deep breath, feeling the familiar ache of regret in his chest. "Because I realized that the life I built, it didn't mean anything without you," he said softly. "I thought I was doing what was best, but I was wrong. And I'm here now because I want to try to make things right." Madeline's gaze hardened, a flash of anger sparking in her eyes. "Make things right? You think showing up now, when it's convenient for you, is enough to make things right?" He felt the sting of her words, each one a reminder of his failure. "No, I know it's not enough," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to be here, for as long as you'll let me. I want to know you, to understand what I missed." She looked away, her shoulders tense. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that years ago." The silence that followed was heavy, each unspoken word filling the space between them. Aaron felt the weight of her resentment, the pain he'd caused pressing down on him like a leaden blanket. But he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now, not when there was still a chance, however small, of bridging the gap between them. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, the determination in his voice unwavering. Madeline didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the window as though unwilling to meet his eyes. And in that moment, Aaron understood that whatever fragile progress they'd made was still vulnerable, that earning her trust would be a journey marked by setbacks and slow, careful steps. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension, a careful truce that allowed them to work together without the constant undercurrent of resentment. Aaron threw himself into the work, each task a way to prove his commitment, to show Madeline that he was here not out of convenience, but out of a genuine desire to be a part of her life. Luke's presence remained a constant, the man's watchful gaze a reminder of the life Madeline had built in his absence. Though Aaron respected Luke's role in her life, he couldn't help but feel the sting of being the outsider, the intruder trying to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Madeline paused, her gaze drifting to the fields stretching out before them. "My mother loved this place," she said quietly, her tone softened by a hint of nostalgia. "She used to say that it was our legacy, that one day I'd carry it on." Aaron felt a pang of sadness, the weight of her words a reminder of all he'd missed. "She was an incredible woman," he said softly, "and she raised an incredible daughter." Madeline looked at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something he couldn't quite name. But then she looked away, her shoulders tense as though trying to regain control of her emotions. "I don't need you to tell me that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Aaron nodded, understanding the depth of her pride, her need to protect the life she'd built without him. But he also felt a growing determination to prove that he was here for the long haul, that he was willing to do whatever it took to earn a place in her life. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Madeline," he said gently. "I just want to be a part of this, to help however you'll let me." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the fields beyond. But in that moment, Aaron saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain she carried, the strength it had taken to survive in his absence. And as they stood in silence, Aaron knew that whatever walls remained between them, he was willing to wait, to be patient, for as long as it took. Aaron spent the next several days steeped in farm work, each task both exhausting and strangely grounding. His hands were raw from pulling hay bales, his muscles sore from hours spent mending fences and clearing out stalls. But he found himself embracing the labor, taking comfort in its simplicity. For the first time in years, he felt as though he was building something real, something tangible. Madeline remained a constant presence, her instructions brief and to the point, each one delivered with an air of quiet authority. She moved through the farm with a focus that seemed almost mechanical, her attention fixed on each task, as though the work itself was her way of keeping the world at bay. One evening, as they walked back to the house after a long day, Aaron decided to break the silence. "You know," he began, his tone careful, "this place, it has a way of getting under your skin." Madeline glanced at him, a faint flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "It's just a farm," she replied, her voice dismissive. "Maybe to some people," he replied, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But to me it feels like a legacy." She hesitated, her expression softening for a brief moment. "It was her legacy," she murmured, her gaze distant. "Everything my mother did, every choice she made, was for this place. For us." Aaron felt a pang of guilt, the weight of her words a reminder of all he'd missed. "She was an incredible woman," he said softly. "And you're doing an incredible job carrying on her dream." Madeline looked away, her shoulders tense, as though trying to shield herself from his words. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," she replied, her tone tinged with defensiveness. Aaron nodded, sensing that any further attempts to reach out would only push her further away. But as they walked in silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that Madeline's strength was as much a shield as it was a necessity, a way of protecting herself from the world, and from him. A few days later, Aaron found himself working alone in the barn, repairing a section of the roof that had started to leak after a recent rainstorm. As he hammered the boards back into place, he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Luke standing in the doorway, his gaze steady. "Need a hand?" Luke asked, his tone neutral. Aaron nodded, gesturing to the tools scattered around him. "I could use one, actually." They worked together in silence, the only sounds the scrape of nails against wood and the quiet rustle of hay. Aaron felt the tension between them, the unspoken resentment that hung like a cloud. But he kept his focus on the work, hoping that Luke's willingness to help was a sign of progress. After a while, Luke broke the silence, his voice low and edged with frustration. "You know, I don't get you," he said, his tone blunt. "You walk out on her mother, leave her to raise a kid on her own, and now you just show up, expecting, what? A warm welcome?" Aaron swallowed, the sting of Luke's words cutting deep. "I didn't expect anything," he replied quietly. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I couldn't stay away." Luke shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. "So you came back because of some guilt complex? Or are you just here to ease your conscience?" Aaron felt his frustration rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I came back because I wanted to know her," he said, his voice steady. "Because I wanted a chance to be part of her life, however small." Luke's gaze softened, though his expression remained skeptical. "You think that's what she needs? Another man in her life, promising things he can't deliver?" Aaron held Luke's gaze, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I don't know what she needs," he admitted, "but I know what I'm here to offer, whatever she'll let me give." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the unspoken tension between them lingering. But then Luke nodded, a reluctant acknowledgement that, while it might not be enough, Aaron's intentions were sincere. "Just don't expect her to trust you," Luke muttered, his tone softer but still guarded. "She's had enough people let her down." Aaron nodded, understanding the weight of Luke's warning. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I just want her to know that I'm here for as long as she'll let me be." Luke's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he nodded, a quiet acceptance that, though fragile, was a step toward understanding. As the days wore on, Aaron found himself settling into the rhythm of the farm, his presence becoming less of an intrusion and more of a quiet addition to Madeline's world. Though she remained guarded, there were moments, small, almost imperceptible, when he sensed a shift in her demeanor, a subtle softening of the walls she kept so carefully in place. One evening, as they sat together on the porch after a long day, Aaron found himself drawn to the silence between them, the quiet comfort of shared exhaustion. He glanced at her, studying the lines of strain etched into her face, the resilience that had carried her through so much. "Madeline," he began, his voice gentle, "I don't want to push, but I'd like to understand more about your life here. What it was like growing up on this farm." She looked at him, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face before she turned away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It was hard," she admitted, her tone quiet, "watching her work day and night, knowing there was no one else to help." Aaron felt a pang of guilt, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy burden. "She shouldn't have had to do it alone," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. "And neither should you." Madeline's expression hardened, a flash of anger in her eyes. "Well, she did, and so did I." The bitterness in her tone was unmistakable, a reminder of all the years he'd missed, the moments he could never reclaim. But he knew that he couldn't change the past. All he could do was be here now, to offer his support in whatever way she would allow. "I understand," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I'm here now, for as long as you'll have me." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. But in that moment, Aaron felt a fragile hope, a sense that perhaps, with time, they might find a way to bridge the distance between them. The following day, Aaron woke early to find Madeline already at work in the barn, her movements efficient and focused. He joined her, the silence between them filled with a quiet tension, each of them careful not to disturb the fragile truce they'd built. As they worked, Luke arrived, his expression tight as he approached. He glanced between them, a hint of frustration in his eyes, before gesturing for Aaron to step aside. "Can we talk?" Luke asked, his tone firm. Aaron nodded, following him outside. Once they were alone, Luke turned to him, his gaze sharp. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to prove here, but Madeline doesn't need you complicating things." Aaron took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of Luke's distrust. "I'm not here to complicate anything," he replied calmly. "I just want to be part of her life, if she'll let me." Luke shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You think she needs you now? After all these years?" "I know I don't have the right to expect anything," Aaron replied, his voice steady. But I'm here because I want to be here, because I want to know her, to understand the life she's built. Luke's gaze softened, though his expression remained skeptical. Well, don't expect her to just let you in. She spent her whole life doing things on her own. Aaron nodded, understanding the weight of Luke's words. I don't expect anything, he said quietly, but I'm willing to wait for as long as it takes. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the unspoken tension between them hanging in the air. Finally, Luke nodded, a reluctant acceptance that, while far from trust, was a step forward. Just don't make her regret it, he muttered, his tone a quiet warning. Aaron nodded, his gaze steady. I won't. That evening, as they sat down to a quiet dinner, Aaron could feel a subtle shift in Madeline's demeanor, a quiet openness that hinted at the possibility of something more. He wanted to ask her about her life, to understand the years he'd missed, but he knew that any questions would only push her away. Instead, he let the silence settle between them, the unspoken words filling the space in a way that felt strangely comforting. And as they sat together, sharing a quiet meal, he felt a fragile hope take root, a sense that perhaps he was finally beginning to find his place in her life. After dinner, as they washed the dishes together, Aaron spoke up, his voice soft. Madeline, I know I can't make up for the past, but I'm grateful to be here, to see this place, to be a part of it, however small. She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes before she turned away, her expression guarded. Well, don't expect me to start calling you Dad or anything, she muttered, her tone dismissive. He chuckled, a small, genuine laugh that felt like a release. Fair enough, he replied, his tone warm. I'll settle for Aaron. She didn't respond, but a faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth, a sign that, however reluctantly, she was beginning to accept his presence. And as they worked in comfortable silence, Aaron felt a sense of peace, a quiet reminder that, while the journey was far from over, he was finally taking the first steps toward reconciliation. The next morning, Aaron woke to the sound of rain pattering against the roof of the barn. Outside, the world was shrouded in gray mist, the steady drizzle turning the fields into a patchwork of mud and puddles. He pulled on his coat and boots, feeling the weight of the cold settle into his bones as he stepped outside. Madeline was already at work, her movements brisk despite the rain. Aaron watched her for a moment, her quiet resilience a reminder of all she'd carried alone. He approached her carefully, sensing that today would be no different in the guarded distance she kept between them. Need a hand? He asked, his voice gentle. She looked up, her expression unreadable as she studied him. I've managed just fine without one, she replied, her tone sharp. He nodded, taking her words in stride. I know, but maybe it'll go faster if we work together. Madeline's gaze softened slightly, the faintest hint of appreciation flickering in her eyes. But then she looked away, her expression hardening. Fine, but just don't get in the way, she muttered, brushing past him. They worked side by side in silence, each of them carefully avoiding the other's gaze. Aaron could feel the tension simmering between them, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance, but he knew that any attempt to push would only cause her to pull away. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he spoke. Madeline, I know this hasn't been easy. I know my being here, it complicates things. She paused, her hands stilling as she looked up at him, a mixture of anger and pain in her eyes. Complicates things? She echoed, her tone edged with bitterness. You think that's all this is? Aaron felt the sting of her words, the accusation beneath the surface. No, he replied quietly. I know it's more than that. I know I hurt you. She looked away, her shoulders tense. Then why did you come back? Why now, after all these years? He took a deep breath, the weight of her question settling over him. Because I couldn't stay away, he admitted. Because I wanted to know you. I wanted a chance to make things right, even if I know I can never fully do that. Madeline's gaze hardened, her anger simmering just below the surface. Make things right, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You think showing up now is going to make up for all the years you weren't here? For everything my mother went through alone? Aaron felt the familiar ache of regret tighten in his chest. No, I don't. I know I can't change the past, and I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. But I want to try, Madeline. I want to be here, for however long you'll let me. She shook her head, a bitter smile crossing her face. You don't get it, do you? She said softly. You left, and in doing that, you took away any chance we had of being a family. You were nothing but a ghost, someone I stopped believing in a long time ago. Her words hit him like a blow, each one a reminder of all the years he'd missed, the moments he could never reclaim. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he was sorry, but he knew that words would never be enough. I know I let you down, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. And I know I can't make up for it. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Madeline's expression hardened, her gaze cold as she looked at him. Maybe it would be better if you did, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy, each unspoken word filling the space between them. Aaron felt the weight of her resentment, the pain he'd caused pressing down on him like a shroud. But he knew he couldn't walk away, not now, not when there was still a chance, however small, of earning her trust. I'm not leaving, he said quietly, the determination in his voice unwavering. Madeline didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the horizon. And in that moment, Aaron understood that whatever fragile progress they'd made was still vulnerable, that earning her forgiveness would be a journey marked by setbacks and slow, careful steps. The rain continued into the afternoon, soaking the fields and turning the dirt paths into rivers of mud. Aaron and Madeline worked in silence, each of them focused on the task at hand, the unspoken tension between them lingering like a shadow. As they finished repairing the last section of fence, Madeline straightened, her gaze distant. I'm going to check on the animals, she said, her tone curt. Aaron nodded, sensing her need for space. I'll clean up here, he replied, watching as she walked away, her shoulders tense. He could feel the weight of her rejection, the finality of her words pressing down on him. But even as the sting of her coldness lingered, he knew he couldn't leave. Not yet, not when there was still a chance, however small, of finding a way forward. Later that evening, as he made his way back to the house, he noticed Luke's truck parked near the barn. Luke stood by the door, his expression unreadable as he watched Aaron approach. You got a lot of nerve, you know that? Luke said, his tone flat. Aaron stopped, meeting Luke's gaze. I'm not here to cause trouble, he replied, his voice steady. I'm just trying to be part of her life. Luke scoffed, crossing his arms. Part of her life? Where were you when her mother was struggling to keep this place running? Where were you when Madeline needed someone to teach her how to get by? The accusation cut deep, each word a reminder of all he'd missed. I wasn't there, he admitted quietly, and I'll always regret that. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. Luke's expression softened, though his tone remained guarded. Just don't expect her to forgive you. Madeline doesn't need someone swooping in, trying to fix things. She's done just fine without you. Aaron nodded, accepting the weight of Luke's warning. I know she doesn't need me, he said softly. But maybe, just maybe, I need her, and I'm willing to wait for as long as it takes. Luke's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he nodded, a reluctant acknowledgement of Aaron's sincerity. Then I hope you're prepared for the long haul, he muttered, turning back to his truck. As Luke drove away, Aaron felt a surge of resolve, a quiet determination that, while fragile, gave him strength. He knew the journey would be difficult, that Madeline's forgiveness would be a hard one. But he was willing to wait, to earn her trust one step at a time. The next morning, Aaron rose before dawn, the first light of day casting a soft glow over the fields. He found Madeline in the kitchen, her movements brisk as she prepared a simple breakfast. She barely acknowledged him as he entered, her gaze fixed on her task. Morning, he said softly, his voice tentative. She nodded, her expression cool. Morning. They ate in silence, each of them careful to avoid the other's gaze. But as they finished, Aaron cleared his throat, gathering the courage to speak. Madeline, he began, his tone steady. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm not here to take anything from you. I want to be part of your life, however you'll let me. She looked at him, a flicker of anger in her eyes. You think that's what I need? A man who walked out on my mother, trying to make amends now. Aaron swallowed, feeling the weight of her resentment. I don't expect you to need me, he replied quietly. But I want you to know that I'm here, for however long it takes. Madeline looked away, her expression hardening. Maybe it's too late for that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung between them, heavy with finality. Aaron felt the ache of rejection, the familiar sting of loss settling over him like a shroud. But even as the weight of her words pressed down on him, he knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. I understand, he said softly. But I'll be here whenever you're ready. Madeline didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the window as though unwilling to meet his eyes. And in that moment, Aaron knew that whatever progress they'd made was still fragile, that earning her forgiveness would be a journey marked by patience and quiet persistence. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension, a careful truce that allowed them to work together without the constant undercurrent of resentment. Aaron threw himself into the work, each task a way to prove his commitment, to show Madeline that he was here not out of convenience, but out of a genuine desire to be a part of her life. Luke's presence remained a constant, the man's watchful gaze a reminder of the life Madeline had built in his absence. Though Aaron respected Luke's role in her life, he couldn't help but feel the sting of being the outsider, the intruder trying to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Madeline paused, her gaze drifting to the fields stretching out before them. My mother loved this place, she said quietly, her tone softened by a hint of nostalgia. She used to say that it was our legacy, that one day I'd carry it on. Aaron felt a pang of sadness, the weight of her words a reminder of all he'd missed. She was an incredible woman, he said softly, and she raised an incredible daughter. Madeline looked at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something he couldn't quite name. But then she looked away, her shoulders tense, as though trying to regain control of her emotions. I don't need you to tell me that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Aaron nodded, understanding the depth of her pride, her need to protect the life she'd built without him. But he also felt a growing determination to prove that he was here for the long haul, that he was willing to do whatever it took to earn a place in her life. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Madeline, he said gently. I just want to be a part of this, to help, however you'll let me. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the fields beyond. But in that moment, Aaron saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain she carried, the strength it had taken to survive in his absence. And as they stood in silence, Aaron knew that whatever walls remained between them, he was willing to wait, to be patient, for as long as it took. The next morning, Aaron found Madeline waiting outside, a mix of tension and frustration visible in her stance. She held a leather-bound notebook in her hand, worn at the edges as if it had been well used over the years. When she noticed Aaron approaching, she lifted her chin, her gaze fierce and unyielding. I think it's time you see this, she said, her voice controlled but edged with something raw. She held out the notebook, her grip lingering for a second before she released it into his hands. What is it? Aaron asked, his voice hesitant as he took the notebook from her. Madeline's gaze remained fixed on him, a flicker of vulnerability showing through her hard exterior. It's her journal, she replied softly. My mother's journal. She kept it after you left. Aaron felt his heart tighten, the weight of the notebook suddenly heavy in his hands. He looked at Madeline, searching her expression, but her gaze was distant, as if she were steeling herself against the impact of her own decision. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. She nodded, though her expression remained guarded. Read it, she said, her tone firm. Maybe then you'll understand what you left behind. Without another word, Madeline turned and walked away, leaving Aaron standing alone with the journal. He glanced down at the worn cover, the faint scent of old paper rising as he opened it, each page a glimpse into a life he'd once known but had chosen to leave. Aaron spent the next few hours alone in the barn, his hands trembling slightly as he leafed through the journal. Caroline's words spilled across the pages in neat, careful handwriting. Each entry a window into her thoughts, her fears, her dreams. As he read, he felt a sense of intimacy, a closeness to her that he hadn't felt in years. The entries began shortly after he'd left, her words raw and unfiltered, each page filled with a quiet resilience, an unbreakable determination to build a life for herself and Madeline. She wrote about the struggles she faced, the nights she spent awake worrying about the farm, about Madeline, about the choices she'd made, and the future she was determined to build. Madeline deserves the best, even if it means doing this alone. One entry read, the words underlined with the weight of her conviction. I'll make this work somehow. I owe it to her. Aaron felt the familiar ache of regret settle over him, each word a reminder of all he'd missed, of the life he could have had if he'd stayed. But as he read further, he felt something else, a deep admiration for Caroline's strength, her resilience, the quiet determination that had carried her through so many hardships. But then, as he turned to the later entries, he noticed a shift in her tone. The words grew softer, more introspective, her thoughts drifting to the life they might have had together, the family they could have been. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Aaron had stayed. One entry read, if he'd chosen this life, chosen us. But I know that we're better off without the what-ifs. I have Madeline, and she's everything to me. Aaron closed the journal, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He sat in silence, the stillness of the barn pressing down on him as he struggled to process the depth of his absence, the ripple effect it had created in their lives. He'd walked away from a life he hadn't fully understood, and now, faced with the reality of what he'd left behind, he felt a regret so profound it was almost suffocating. As the afternoon wore on, Aaron made his way back to the house, the journal still clutched in his hands. He found Madeline in the kitchen, her expression unreadable as she watched him enter. She seemed to be waiting, her gaze fixed on him with a quiet intensity that made his heart race. He held out the journal, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for letting me read this," he said softly. I don't know what to say." Madeline's expression hardened, her gaze unyielding. "There's nothing to say," she replied, her tone sharp. "That journal, it's the only part of her you'll ever really know. You weren't there for the rest of it." Aaron felt the sting of her words, the bitterness that underlined every syllable. "I know," he said quietly, his voice steady, "and I know I can't make up for it. But I want you to know that I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked away, her shoulders tense. "That doesn't change anything," she muttered. "It doesn't erase the years she spent alone, or the nights I watched her work until she couldn't stand. You don't get to just show up now and pretend like that means something." Aaron swallowed, feeling the weight of her resentment pressing down on him. "I'm not pretending, Madeline. I'm trying to be here, for however long you'll let me." Madeline's gaze shifted, a flicker of vulnerability showing through her hardened exterior. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pretend like you weren't just a ghost my whole life? Like you didn't leave us?" The silence that followed was heavy, each unspoken word filling the space between them. Aaron felt the weight of her pain, the anger she'd held on to for so long, and he knew that there were no words that could fix this, no apology that could erase the years he'd missed. Finally, he took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said softly. "I just want a chance to be here, to be whatever you'll let me be." Madeline's expression softened for a brief moment, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. But then, just as quickly, her defenses snapped back into place, her gaze cold and unyielding. "Maybe it would be better if you just left," she said quietly, her voice filled with finality. "I don't need you here. I never did." Aaron felt the familiar ache of rejection settle over him, her words cutting through him like a knife. But he knew that walking away now would only deepen the distance between them, that leaving her life again would be an act of surrender he couldn't allow himself. "I understand," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not leaving." Madeline looked away, her shoulders tense as though trying to shield herself from his words. And in that moment, Aaron knew that whatever fragile bond they'd begun to build was still vulnerable, that earning her trust would be a journey marked by patience and quiet persistence. Over the next few days, Aaron kept his distance, giving Madeline the space she seemed to need. He threw himself into the work, each task a way to prove his commitment, to show her that he was here not out of guilt, but out of a genuine desire to be a part of her life. Luke's presence remained constant, his watchful gaze a reminder of the life Madeline had built in Aaron's absence. Though Aaron respected Luke's role in her life, he couldn't help but feel the sting of being the outsider, the intruder trying to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. One evening, as they worked together mending the fence near the edge of the property, Luke turned to him, his expression serious. "You're really not leaving, are you?" he asked, his tone a mixture of resignation and curiosity. Aaron shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "No," he replied quietly. "I'm not." Luke studied him for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Good," he muttered, his tone softer than usual. "She needs someone who won't give up on her." The words caught Aaron off guard, a flicker of gratitude filling him as he met Luke's gaze. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. Luke nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Just don't make me regret it," he replied, his tone a quiet warning. Aaron nodded, understanding the weight of Luke's words. "I won't," he promised, his voice steady. And in that moment, Aaron felt a sense of quiet determination settle over him, a conviction that, while fragile, gave him strength. He knew the journey would be difficult, that earning Madeline's trust would be a hard one. But he was willing to wait, to be patient, for as long as it took. The days slipped by, each one marked by a tentative truce between Aaron and Madeline. Though she remained distant, there were moments, brief and fleeting, when he sensed a shift in her demeanor, a subtle softening of the walls she kept so carefully in place. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the fading light casting a warm glow over the fields, Aaron found himself drawn to the silence between them, the quiet comfort of shared exhaustion. "Madeline," he began, his voice gentle, "I don't want to push, but I'd like to understand more about your life here, about what it was like growing up on this farm." She looked at him, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face before she turned away, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It was hard," she admitted, her tone quiet, watching her work day and night, knowing there was no one else to help. Aaron felt a pang of guilt, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy burden. "She shouldn't have had to do it alone," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. "And neither should you." Madeline's expression hardened, a flash of anger in her eyes. "Well, she did, and so did I." The bitterness in her tone was unmistakable, a reminder of all the years he'd missed, the moments he could never reclaim. But he knew that he couldn't change the past. All he could do was be here now, to offer his support in whatever way she would allow. "I understand," he said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I'm here now, for as long as you'll have me." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky. But in that moment, Aaron felt a fragile hope, a sense that perhaps, with time, they might find a way to bridge the distance between them. As the weeks passed, the chill of winter seeped deeper into the valley, leaving a thin layer of frost on the fields each morning. Aaron rose early each day, finding solace in the rhythm of the work. Though Madeline remained guarded, he could sense a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet acceptance of his presence, even if it was tinged with reluctance. One evening, as they finished stacking firewood for the coming cold months, Aaron glanced at Madeline, studying the lines of strain etched into her face. She worked with a determination that was both admirable and heartbreaking, each movement filled with a quiet strength he knew she'd had to cultivate on her own. "Madeline," he began, his tone tentative, "I know it hasn't been easy having me here, and I know I've asked for a lot, maybe more than I have any right to. But I want you to know that I'm here, for as long as you'll let me be." Madeline looked at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and something else, something softer, perhaps even vulnerable. She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the ground. "Why, Aaron?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why are you so determined to stay? He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Because I've spent too much time running away, he admitted. And I've learned that sometimes the hardest thing is to stay, to face the things you tried so hard to avoid. I want to be here, Madeline. I want to be part of your life, in whatever way you'll allow. She looked away, her shoulders slumping slightly. It's not that simple, she murmured. You can't just show up after all these years and expect me to just let you in. I know, he replied softly. And I don't expect that. But I'm willing to take it one day at a time. Whatever pace you need, however long it takes. I'll be here. Madeline nodded slowly, a faint flicker of emotion crossing her face. I don't know how to let you in, Aaron, she admitted, her voice tinged with frustration. I've spent so long building walls, keeping people out. I don't know how to just change that. Aaron reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them before he dropped it to his side. You don't have to do it all at once, he said gently. We can take it slow. Just give me a chance. That's all I'm asking. For a long moment, Madeline was silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon as though searching for answers. Finally, she looked at him, her expression softened, the wall she'd built around herself showing the faintest cracks. One day at a time, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. A small, hopeful smile tugged at Aaron's lips. One day at a time, he echoed, feeling a warmth spread through him, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. Winter settled over the farm, blanketing the land in a soft layer of frost that shimmered in the early morning light. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and Aaron found himself drawn to the warmth of the farmhouse, to the quiet comfort of shared routines with Madeline. Though they still worked mostly in silence, there was a new sense of ease between them, a fragile but growing trust that felt like the first steps towards something real. One evening, as they sat together by the fireplace, Aaron glanced at Madeline, his gaze softening as he took in her relaxed posture, the faint flicker of a smile at the corners of her mouth. He wanted to ask her about her childhood, about the years he'd missed, but he knew that any questions would have to come at her pace. Instead, he spoke quietly, his voice filled with quiet sincerity. You know, this place, it feels like home, he admitted. It's strange after all these years, but it feels like I've finally found where I'm supposed to be. Madeline looked at him, her expression thoughtful. This place, it was her dream, she said softly, a faint sadness in her voice. She used to say that this farm was our legacy, that one day, I'd carry it on. Aaron felt a pang of regret, the weight of her words a reminder of all he'd missed. She was right, he said gently, and you've done an incredible job carrying it on. She would be proud of you, Madeline. She looked away, her shoulders tense, as though trying to shield herself from his words. I'm just doing what needs to be done, she replied, her tone dismissive. But there was a faint blush on her cheeks, a flicker of gratitude that she quickly masked. Aaron decided to leave it at that, sensing that any further attempts to express his admiration would only make her retreat. Instead, he let the silence settle between them, the quiet warmth of the fire filling the room as they sat together, each lost in their own thoughts. As the weeks went by, Aaron and Madeline continued to find small ways to bridge the gap between them. They worked side by side, each task a quiet reminder of the resilience that had carried them both through so much. Though they rarely spoke of the past, there was a new understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the pain they shared and the tentative hope for something more. One evening, as they were preparing dinner, Madeline glanced at him, her gaze thoughtful. You know, she began hesitantly, I used to wonder what you were like. My mother never talked about you much, so I had to imagine. Aaron felt a pang of guilt, the weight of her words settling over him. I'm sorry, he said softly. I never meant to be absent. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. I know, and maybe it was better that way. It made it easier to believe you didn't care. The admission cut deep, a reminder of the impact his absence had left on her. But he held her gaze, his voice steady. I did care, Madeline. I still do. And I know I can't make up for the years I missed, but I want you to know that I'm here now, for as long as you'll let me be. She looked away, her expression unreadable. but there was a faint flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a hint of the pain she'd carried alone for so long. "Maybe it's too late for that," she murmured, though her tone lacked the bitterness it once held. "Maybe," he replied softly, "but I'm still here, and I'm willing to wait, however long it takes." They stood in silence, the quiet understanding between them filling the space with a sense of possibility, a fragile hope that, despite the years that had separated them, there might still be a way forward. Spring arrived gradually, the frost melting away to reveal the first hints of new growth. The farm began to come alive, the fields turning green, the trees budding with fresh leaves. Aaron felt a quiet satisfaction as he worked the land, the physical labor grounding him in a way that felt almost healing. Madeline's demeanor had softened, her once guarded presence now open to small moments of connection. They shared more meals, more conversations, each one a quiet step toward building the trust they both needed. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of the fence near the far pasture, Madeline paused, her gaze drifting over the fields. "I used to think this place would always be mine," she said quietly. "That I'd be alone here, carrying on her dream." Aaron looked at her, sensing the vulnerability beneath her words. "You don't have to be alone, Madeline," he said gently. "I'm here, and I want to help." She met his gaze, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you still here, after everything?" He took a deep breath, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Because you're worth it," he replied. "And because I want to be here with you." Madeline looked away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. But there was a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, a sign that, however reluctantly, she was beginning to let him in. As the weeks turned into months, Aaron and Madeline found a new rhythm together, their shared work on the farm bringing them closer in ways they hadn't anticipated. Though there were still moments of tension, of old wounds surfacing, they were learning to navigate the complexities of their relationship, each one finding strength in the other. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Madeline broke the silence, her voice filled with quiet sincerity. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up, for staying." Aaron looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I'll never give up on you, Madeline," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. "For as long as you'll have me, I'll be here." She nodded, a small, genuine smile breaking through her usual guarded expression. "Then I guess, maybe I can start to trust that." And in that moment, Aaron knew that they had finally found a place of understanding, a quiet peace that allowed them to move forward together, one step at a time. Months later, the farm was thriving, each field a testament to the resilience of the land and the people who tended it. Aaron and Madeline had found a quiet rhythm, their once fraught exchanges now filled with warmth and understanding. As they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset dip below the horizon, Aaron felt a sense of contentment, a peace he hadn't known in years. He looked at Madeline, his heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at him, her expression softened. "For what?" "For letting me be a part of this," he replied. "For giving me a chance?" Madeline nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "One day at a time," she said, her voice filled with quiet hope. And as they sat together, side by side, Aaron knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, one day at a time. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey through the long way home. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more like it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. Your support helps keep this channel going, and each like, share, and subscription truly makes a difference. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Aaron and Madeline's journey toward healing. Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.